Well, good morning, brothers and sisters. Thank you for joining me for this devotion. Today we are in Romans chapter 14, and before we read some of the verses, I want to give you some background to help you understand and properly interpret chapter 14, because it can be a little confusing if you don't have some of this background, and people can misapply some of what Paul says here. Paul writes what we call the book of Romans. It was really a letter that he wrote to the Christians, believers, to the church in the city of Rome, which, as you know, was the capital of the Roman Empire. And we would think of it as a secular city, but it was a very religious city because the Romans had many gods. They were polytheistic. And so there were a lot of idols and a lot of temples and worship of these pagan gods, rituals and all that, and holidays was part of their life, part of their culture. And the worship of Romans, when they would worship their pagan gods and idols, involved several things. For instance, it involved animal sacrifice, just like in Judaism. They would sacrifice animals to those gods. Some of them, in some of their religious practices, would actually drink the blood of those sacrificed animals. Something that may shock you, but was also a common occurrence in ancient worship at their temples, was having sex with what was called temple prostitutes. And that sex could be either heterosexual or homosexual, and it was considered an act of worship. It took place at the temple with sacred temple prostitutes. And quite often the meat of the animal that was sacrificed, part of it was kept back and sold in restaurants. People could buy it and eat it. Now, Jews obviously would not participate in any of those practices because they contradicted Judaism, and Christians did not either. So in the Roman church, you had believers both of Jewish background and Gentile background. So someone gets saved, and they don't, let's say a Roman citizen, a Gentile in Rome gets saved, became a Christian, joined the church in Rome, then he would stop participating in the sacrificing of animals and the drinking blood and the sex at the temple and all of that. Now, one of the areas, though, that was controversial, where there were differing opinions, was, all right, what about the meat from the animals that had been sacrificed? Because that meat then is put in restaurants and stores and sold. Is it okay for a believer to eat that meat? Some said yes, others said no, and it was controversial in the church in Rome and in other churches as well. And so Paul deals with it here in Romans 14, as well as other places in the New Testament. Now, with that background, let's read the first 4 verses. He says, "Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things," referring to this meat that had been sacrificed at the temples. "But he who is weak eats vegetables only. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him." What Paul says is neither group is to judge and criticize the other. Now let that sink in. Neither group is to judge and criticize the other. He even makes it very, very clear at the end of verse 3 that God has accepted the one who eats the meat. Verse 4, "Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls." Well, our master is God. And so Paul says, "And he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand." So those who believed it was wrong to eat the meat, don't you dare judge those who eat it. Those of you who eat the meat, don't you dare judge the others who don't eat it. Now, you also need to note that he called the ones who felt it was wrong to eat weak. They had the weaker faith. Another issue, very similar, is holidays, special occasions, verses 5 and 6. "For one person regards one day above another, Another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord. He who eats does it for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not for the Lord, he does not eat and gives thanks to God. In other words, it's the same principle over these holidays. Stop judging one another because you're both living for the Lord and doing it for the Lord. Don't judge those who disagree with you on these issues. Verse 10, but you, why do you judge your brother? Or you again, why do you regard your brother with contempt? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. I'm going to answer to God. You are going to answer to God. Each and every believer is going to answer to God. God will judge us. God will judge me. God will judge you. God will judge them. Stop judging each other over these differences of opinions about all these rules. Now look at verses 12 and 13. So then, he says, each one of us will give an account of himself to God. That's what I was just saying. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore. Pretty clear, isn't it? He repeats it time and time again. But rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way. We're going to answer to God alone. But even though we don't judge one another, we are to care about one another's faith. Not put obstacles in each other's faith. Now that can work both directions. We are to, the weak are to care about the faith of the strong are to care about the faith of the weak. Those who eat the meat are to care about the faith of those who don't. Those who do not eat the meat are to care about the faith of those who do eat the meat. And again, note that the weak are those who have all these rules and say you can't eat the meat and you cannot observe any of these holidays. Those who have a bunch of rules, do's and don'ts, he says actually have the weaker faith, not the stronger faith. Verses 14 and 15. I know, now this is Paul, he says, I know and am convinced in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself. Talking about that meat. Just because it had been sacrificed to an animal, to an idol, and then it's gone somewhere else to be sold in a restaurant, he says, does not make it unclean. But to him who thinks anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. If in your mind it's unclean, well, then to you it is unclean and you should not eat it. But the reality is it's really not unclean. Verse 15, for if because of food your brother is hurt, you are no longer walking according to love, do not destroy with your food him for whom Christ died. So there will be times when, because we care about the faith of our brothers or sisters, that we voluntarily choose not to do something, not to eat the meat or whatever it may happen to be, because we want to build their faith up, not tear it down. Look at verses 19 and following. So then we pursue the things which make for peace and the building up of one another. Now notice, not just the building up, one group building up the other, the building up of each other, of one another. Both sides have to figure out how to build up the faith of the other. Do not tear down the work of God for the sake of food. All things are indeed clean, but they are evil for the man who eats and gives offense. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or to do anything by which your brother stumbles. The faith which you have as your own conviction before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he is approving. In other words, whatever you believe about any of these issues, you have to be convinced yourself. Now, Paul's not talking about a bunch of silly rules. Like in our culture over the decades, Christians have had silly rules had nothing to do with past pagan religions. You see, the issue here was that some of these Gentile believers might be tempted to go back into their pre-Jesus lifestyle. Or people of strong Jewish background who never participated in that might be offended by it. Religious practices. That's different than some of the silly rules over the years. When I got saved and started growing in Jesus back in the 70s, the length of your hair was a rule. whether or not you could get your ear pierced was a rule. On and on, how does a preacher dress? That was a rule. None of that has anything to do with pagan religious practices that might cause somebody to fall back into an old lifestyle. Those were just silly man-made cultural rules, and it was wrong for anyone to force those kind of things on anybody. It's talking about something different here. But there are some lessons for us in this. When it comes to these really important issues, you have to be convinced in your own mind and do what is right in your own mind and your own heart, and do it for the Lord. But he's also very clear in this chapter, do not judge those who disagree with you. Today, if you think there's some rules and others think, no, those rules don't matter, so long as you're not violating Bible, violating cultural expectations is one thing. Violating the Scripture is something totally different. Man-made rules don't count. God's rules do. And so stop judging one another both directions. Sometimes those whose faith is stronger need to voluntarily choose not to do some things in certain moments, certain situations, because it might hurt the faith of others. For instance, here at First Baptist, as pastors and deacons, we choose not to drink, socially or otherwise, because it could hurt the faith of someone. That's a choice we make. Now, the goal is to build up the faith of others, to pursue peace. He makes that really clear here. But he says we are to build up one another's faith, and in chapter 15, verse 7, accept one another. Now, here's the mistake some people make. Some people only apply the teaching of this chapter one direction. The strong always have to give in to the weak. Well, the weak are also responsible for strengthening the faith of the strong and accepting the strong, which means Paul here in this chapter very clearly said to the weak, you are the weaker Christian. Your faith is the weaker one, which means that a strong person might work with you and voluntarily choose not to do certain things, but it means you've got to get stronger in your faith, accept them, and grow. It's not an excuse for you to stay weak in your faith. So this is harder to do than it is talk about sometimes. Love means we find a way to work it out together. And love means that sometimes the strong are patient with the weak, and it means also that the weak grow and get stronger. It goes both directions, not just one direction. I hope that helps you as you read this chapter. I know I went a little longer today than usual, but I hope it helps. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow.